Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today, I'll be experimenting with oxidizing iron filings to get a real rust weathering effect during the build of this Junkyard K-2SO bust. Alright, for starters, this is a paid file from DroidDivision on Etsy. I will link it, as well as all the materials I used, down in the description below. The internals of K2's eyes were also modified by me using files I found on Thingiverse. I will link them as well. The prep work on this build was pretty standard, and in the interest of time, I'll spare you having to watch me do most of it. The only unique part of prep in this build was that I needed to do a bit of hole filling using epoxy putty, and then sanded my resin parts from 220 grit up to 400. I wood filled the PLA and sanded that to 220, and after filler primer, wet sanded that to 400. A majority of the smaller pieces on this build will eventually be painted with Vallejo's metal color, so first they need a coat of Rust-Oleum satin black. For the larger pieces of the head, I painted everything with a base coat of flat brown. If I were to do this again, I wouldn't bother with this step, since later on down the line, I realized it was completely unnecessary. My initial thought was that in doing my rust layer, I might accidentally expose a base layer of paint, and I wanted that base layer to be brown to match the rust. But again, I later learned that this was completely unnecessary. When it comes to making printed parts look like metal, I've found that the best technique is to slowly build up multiple passes of dry brushing. I try to roughly establish a direction for the grain to mimic brushed metal, but overall, I'm being pretty sporadic with my brush strokes. Some spots like the edges will end up brighter than the rest, and this inconsistency in brightness will really help sell the look of old metal. Although it's probably not the most realistic take on the manufacturing process of a droid if it were in the real world, I was sort of loosely going off the assumption that the lower parts of K2's head were built using some sort of aluminum or alloy that didn't rust, in order to act as a heat sink for the massive amount of heat his computer processor would be putting out. And the larger parts of his head were constructed from steel. Again, this probably isn't very realistic, since the larger parts of K2 would probably also be constructed using some sort of light metal like aluminum, but it just looks cool. So let's pretend that the Empire was undergoing lots of budget cuts and had to resort to using cheaper materials, more automation, less hands-on craftsmanship, etc. Let's just say the Empire is definitely not union friendly. In the movie, K2's neck and brain are made from much shinier polished metal, and so for that I used all-clad polished aluminum. I forgot to buy a clear coat to go over my Rust-Oleum black, so I just went for it and sprayed all-clad directly on top of Rust-Oleum. I was kind of worried that this wouldn't work out, since I believe all-clad is lacquer based, but it worked out great. And so if you were wondering, as far as I know, it's totally fine to spray all-clad on top of Rust-Oleum. I wanted his neck to look like it had been broken or melted with a laser blast or something, and so I used my soldering iron to cut away at the neck and melt bits of the edges. Then I went over top of that with more all-clad. Overall, the DroidDivision files were beautifully designed, but the actual eye piece was a bit too simple for my needs, and so I actually found an alternate version of K2's eyes on Thingiverse, which I then modified further so that I could have one eye popping out of the socket. For the body of that exposed eye, I actually used the exposed internals of Cal Kestis's lightsaber from one of my previous builds. I had to do a bit of modifying and tweaking on that model to get the eye to fit, but in the end, I'm really happy with the way that it looks. Because I wanted K2 to look like he had just been pulled from a junkyard and maybe plugged in for data retrieval or something, instead of using constant LEDs, I opted for flickering LEDs. This worked out really nice and just adds another layer of storytelling to this piece. I also added a few more wires to the exposed eye to add just a bit more visual interest. At this point in the process, I was feeling pretty nervous. I couldn't quite see the final product in my head, and so I definitely sat and stared at these pieces for much longer than I should have before beginning with my soldering iron. When I finally got up the courage to start using my soldering iron, I took it very slow and kept reminding myself that no matter what happened, there would always be a way to fix it. Or at least I hoped that would be the case. Again, I really struggled at this point. I think it was mostly just a couldn't see the forest for the trees sort of situation, since I had spent so much time making this dome nice and round, and I was so scared that melting it would cause some sort of irreparable damage, and I never quite knew when enough battle damage was enough, and how much would ultimately show through on the final product after the rust effects, so I went very slow, laboring over every scratch and hole. In the end, I think I may have gone a hair overboard, but I'm still very happy with the final product. Once I was finished with the battle damage, I painted everything with the flat brown, which was totally unnecessary. But then once that had dried, I covered everything in a matte varnish, just in case the lacquer-based paint I was using next had a bad reaction with this brown paint. This next step comes courtesy of The Craftsman here on YouTube. I stumbled across one of his videos a few months back, and it's what inspired me to try this process on this build. I'll link his video in the description, but essentially the process goes like this. He used matte Mod Podge to act as a glue for placing the iron filings wherever he wanted them. And then once that had dried, he went back over the filings using a mixture of hydrogen peroxide, vinegar, and salt, which produces a chemical reaction that oxidizes the iron and creates real rust. Now, initially I thought I would take this one step further in realism and do my rust layer under the paint so that I could sand through the paint and activate the rust and hopefully get a bit of paint bubble to further add to that realistic rust look. Unfortunately, my idea did not work very well, and so if I were to do this again, I would just paint my color and then apply matte Mod Podge and the iron filings. The color I used for these pieces is Tamiya's TS40, which is a lacquer-based paint, and the same paint recommended by the 501st Legion for use on the Death Trooper helmet. It's a great paint to work with, but like I said a minute ago, this sanding through the paint idea was just not a great idea. Here or there it did work and it did rust, but it was a lot more pain than it was worth, and so again, if I were to do this project over, I would just apply the iron filings on top of this paint instead of under. Because I wasn't happy with the overall effect, I did go back off camera and add more matte Mod Podge and iron filings, which was much easier to rust. Initially, I planned to hide a power cord going down through the exposed wiring of the neck, but eventually just settled on using a 9-volt battery to power the lights in the head. Along with the lights in the eyes, I also gave the brain a few flickering and flashing lights just to further imply that the computer was just barely functioning. I have a huge bag of white LEDs I bought a long time ago, and so anytime I need a colored LED, I just use a few drops of alcohol ink and clear resin to dye the head of the bulb. Alright, on to the best part of every project, weathering. I mixed up my classic motor oil wash using cheap acrylics and very carefully applied it all over the brain, and then went to town soaking the rest of the head. Because I wanted the final product to be extra dirty, I made sure to use less water so that the mix was extra thick. Once the wash was basically dry, I moved on to my favorite weathering technique, pastel chalks. One thing that I kept in mind on this project was that I didn't want all the metal to look like it was the same metal. And so for these more sensitive internal pieces, I made sure to not use any rust colors and just stuck to dark browns, blacks, and a little bit of green. I did the same thing on the neck pieces, but did add just a hair of lighter brown to add a bit of variation to that dirt look. I wasn't super happy with the fact that the rust was largely uniform in color, and so I went back with some bright orange chalk to add just a bit of variation to the rust layer. Pretty late in the process, I realized that through this exposed eye socket, you could see the electronics and a few unpainted resin parts. So to remedy this, I quickly whipped up an eye socket using junk pieces I had laying around. I used an IKEA sink drain, an extra part from the Obi-Wan hilt build I did a few weeks ago, an extra tusk from the K-2 model, and a spacer that I wrapped in copper wire. I glued all these pieces together and then wrapped them in HVAC tape just to be safe, and then painted them with flat brown and black, making sure that the copper wire stayed clean. I'm really happy with the way this turned out, and I feel like the shine off of that clean copper wire way back in the head adds a really nice layer of depth and detail to this build. The final problem to solve was how to mount the head. The original file comes with a really nice display base that is made to look like his head is sitting on his shoulders, but because I had broken the neck of my K2, I had to come up with a different solution. I figured out the angle the head needed to sit at, and then printed up this little stop piece and a base that would hold a stainless steel rod that I had laying around. I used 5-minute epoxy to glue everything in place, and then this droid was ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. On this project, I really had to trust the process, since like I said earlier, there was never a point where I really felt like I could envision the final product in my head. But I'm very happy I stuck with it, and I'm very proud of the end result. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a new video every Saturday. Thanks again for watching. Have a good day.